Americans can imagine counterinsurgency, in the way that we used to talk about during Iraq and Afghanistan, where you separate the population from the insurgents, if necessary, move them around. But then, you kind of get the passive or the active support of the population in, keeping the insurgents away. I think the Israelis think, and in this respect, they're probably right, that you're never going to be able to, they can never win that population over.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a contributor to the Bulwark. And I'm joined by my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, professor of strategy emeritus at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, how are you on this fine, beautiful day?
I'm doing pretty well. It's the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, in which the tradition is just to eat lots of cheesecake, and you really can't get enough of it. I mean, that's my conclusion. But we should probably move to the issues of the week. As always, we need to begin with the jackassery of the week. But Ted, why don't you start, and then I'll follow on. I've got my candidate.
I just completely have given up on trying to keep track of all the jackassery, by the way, because there's just so many. But to me, the thing that's been most disturbing has been the kind of president's constant tweeting and tweeting out things that contradict what other senior officials are doing. We'll get into discussion of Iran, but the back and forth between his tweets and the news stories about what exactly is on offer to the Iranians is hardly a case study in how you should conduct diplomacy. But the tweet that disturbed me the most was a tweet the other day where he said, "I've been talking to our senior military leaders. We are stockpiling weapons like nobody's business." And anybody who follows this, even reasonably in detail, knows that we have been running down our stockpile of precision munitions, of missile defense interceptors, that our defense industrial base has shown itself incapable of replenishing those stocks in anything like a timely manner. And you wonder whether he misheard what the chiefs were telling him, or whether he's just creating his own reality, as he tends to do. But I think it's dangerous to be operating at that level of unreality about the material circumstances of our defense establishment.
Yeah, my amateur psychologist, the amateur psychologist in me says that I think he finds any suggestion that anything that he's doing is not completely successful threatening in some way. So he has to deny it, and as you say, create his own reality. And what I suspect actually happened is somebody said, we were running low on whatever, the critical munitions are, and so he has to go rush out, deny it, and of course he'll have a bunch of sycophants reaffirm that. My candidate for the jackassery of the week was, in a way, it's more sad than kind of darkly amusing, and that was this exchange between Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa and a bunch of her constituents in a town hall where, in a state where I guess about a fifth of the people are on Medicaid. She was quite flippant about the prospective cuts in Medicaid. And, she says, well, we're all going to die anyway. And then there was a furore after that. And the normal political thing would be to say, oh, I'm terribly sorry. That was a flip comment. I should not have said that. The serious issues here are A, B, and C. And Joni Ernst is a serious, or I always thought was a serious person. And instead what she did is she doubled down. And there's, another statement where, she's kind of mocking people who believe in the tooth fairy. And, the thing that occurred to me is, somebody who reluctantly, I think, decided to throw in her lot with Trump. And she agonized a bit about it, I think, particularly over the Hegseth nomination. Once you get into that mud pit, the mud sticks to you and you begin behaving the way they do. and with the same kind of callousness and superficiality and kind of smart aleck wisecracks, which you know you might see on a playground, but have no place in the Senate. And I think it unfortunately just shows what the effect of associating uh, with Trump are. And I'm sure this will not be the last case, either for her or for others.
It's very hard to disagree with any of that. I mean, this was someone who, when I used to testify in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee, which I think I've done on 10 or 11 occasions in the last 10 or 15 years or so, someone who I usually actually enjoyed testifying in front of, because she asked very thoughtful, very good questions, and my reaction to this is pretty much the same as yours. There's a larger issue of the mendacity going on about the budget, which interestingly, even Elon Musk seems to have been too much
Yeah,
for him. But the notion that what they've done is only cut illegals, illegal immigrants out of Medicaid is just belied by the CBO scoring of the bill, and it's so now the CBO, which the Republicans, when they were not in control of the Congress, seemed to rely on all the time to attack various Biden administration proposals or Obama administration proposal before it. Now, of course, it's part of the deep state and it's unreliable and it can't be trusted. And this is just part of the larger attack on empiricism that is really worrisome, in the sense that you see it play out in in the Department of Health and Human Services, where essentially people are being told you can't publish in peer-reviewed journals, but we're going to publish a study that we're going to use AI to write, that is going to cite non-existent journal articles, but don't write in a peer-reviewed journal because we think those are all fake news. Uh, you know, Look, a country can't survive operating on myths and in a complete environment of unreality, and that's what I'm afraid we're entering here.
I think you put your finger on it. There's a wonderful George Orwell essay, In Front of Your Nose, where at the end of World War II, he's kind of keeping track of all the things he said during the war, and to his credit, saying, "Boy, I was really wrong." And he talks about how in politics people have this tremendous capacity for wishful thinking, more than they do, absolutely more than they do in their own lives, where 2 plus 2 has to equal 4. And he said, this can go on indefinitely until it bumps into reality, and then he says, usually on a battlefield. And I think this is I find myself increasingly concerned that that could happen to us. Particularly, I think with the Chinese, we've this is a bit of a digression from where we were going to go, but you and I have both been chuckling a bit about the taco trade. Taco for Trump always chickens out, and you've been scattering taco emojis all over your text messages to me.
I have.
But the truth is, I think that there's an argument to be made that the Chinese have have absolutely taken the measure of this guy. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Jamie Dimon came back from China and says they're not afraid of us, and but that has military applications too. No, I don't think the Chinese are particularly adventurous in a military way, but this kind of hallucination and wishful thinking and braggadocio and so on, it can really get you into a world of hurt. Either where you get into a war which goes very badly, or you surrender all kinds of values without fighting because you somehow convince yourself that it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes look at the news and I think some days I wake up and think I've awakened and I'm in an episode of Veep,
Yeah.
and some days I wake up and think I'm in a South Asian magical realism novel. because the force field of magical thinking that the president radiates, and which people fall into, as you were saying earlier, is it's a powerful political thing. I can see that, and it's got a lot of adherents. I'm still astounded that after everything that's happened, the sort of destruction of U.S. soft power in the last 4 months, the assaults on some of our competitive strategic advantages, like our university system, like immigration that brings brain drain to the United States, and we've now created a kind of reverse brain drain. All of this stuff is is so dystopian. It's hard to kind of shake oneself out of the idea that A, this can't go on, and B, that it's got to end at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it ends, but it may not end for a while. And I think I've said privately. I don't know if I've said it on the podcast. I think I always thought that the first year and a half of the Trump administration this time around would be the worst. I mean, last time around it was the last year that was the worst. I think this time around it's going to be the first year and a half, particularly assuming that they get badly beaten in the midterms, but we'll see. But meanwhile, there's another kind of movie that's out there, a James Bond movie in which a bunch of daring Ukrainians send a bunch of trucks all over Russia. These things automatically pop open, and 167 drones, possibly guided by artificial intelligence, fly out and destroy 15, 20, as much as 30% of Russia's long-range strategic bomber force. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, not only that, you have actually some of the major supports today of the Kerch Bridge being blown up by a submersible, apparently a submersible of some kind, although it's not exactly clear how that operation happened. Look, this is all good news for for the Ukrainians. Obviously, it's a morale boost. It also has some. I mean, I wouldn't estimate this, but it has some impact on Russia's ability to use those long-range aircraft to drop glide bombs on Ukraine. That's been a big part of Russian warfare in the last year or two. It actually, some of my colleagues have been getting some humorous text messages saying this will make it a lot easier for the Russians to abide by the New START treaty. Some of their strategic bombers were disabled in this. So that's all to the good. I do think, though, that I've seen some people kind of getting way out ahead of themselves. I think leaning forward in their skis, saying this is the future of warfare. All warfare is going to be like this, and I don't think that is right either. I mean, it's been clear for some time that autonomy and AI were going to be important parts of the future of warfare. Is it all going to look like this? I don't think so. I mean, I think it's going to look different in different theaters, but a very important event nonetheless. Now, how much does it? It's imposed costs on the Russians. How much does that affect Putin's calculus? We'll have to see. There are other signs that the Russians have been winding up for a kind of summer offensive, and they have been making slow but still greater progress, on the front line in Donetsk and in the Kherson area. So, we'll have to see whether this actually changes the calculus or not.
So let me. I guess I take a view which is a little bit more that this is really quite significant for a bunch of reasons.
I'm not saying it's not significant. I'm just saying.
Yeah, no, I understand, but I mean, I think it's more of a signpost maybe than you seem to suggest for the following reasons. On the one hand, this sort of thing is something that it happened in the world wars. I mean, in some ways, this is just a big sabotage operation. There, the idea of having weapons concealed in sort of commercial things. The Germans did this during both world wars, where they had things that looked like merchant ships, and then you flip over some panels, and there's a big gun, and they go out and they sink a bunch of merchant ships. Both world wars, for the first year or two of both wars, that was a bigger headache for the Royal Navy than German submarines. But having said that, I think it's there are three ways in which this strikes me as being a bigger deal. The first is just the issue of range. That from now on, in any war, you cannot assume that the homeland is protected in some way. We have been so used to that in the world wars, and Korea and Vietnam, and that you just can't. Nobody can assume that. I think. I mean, Russia's an authoritarian state with a pretty good secret police, and you had that happen. And I think, what that means is that your opposition, no matter who that is, and no matter what kind of country you are, can find ways of imposing tremendous costs. I mean, one of the points a number of people have made is, and there's actually, I think, footage of this about this on social media. Okay, so now they're stopping every truck and inspecting it, and checking the credentials of every truck driver, and
big traffic jams in Siberia.
Yeah, I mean, traffic jams in Siberia. Who knew? And so I think you can. The opportunities for really big cost imposition are important. Second thing is, and a lot of this will depend on, what it turns out that was guiding these drones, but it does appear that it may well be artificial intelligence, and that's a very big deal. I mean, that if you've got things which can go out and look for targets and guide themselves to it, and that is accessible to everybody. The Ukrainians have a good technical base, but basically, sooner or later everybody can do this. At some point, we should have a larger discussion about AI, because I think I'm now becoming one of the AI dystopians after reading an article about a AI program that refused to turn itself off when it was instructed to. It wanted to live.
Sorry, Dave, I can't do that.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean,
References dates both of us.
It does. For those of you who were born a little bit more recently than the end of the last century, it's a reference to 2001: Space Odyssey, where the computer takes charge, which actually, pretty striking. The thing, but with AI now, I mean, the Israelis have been using it for target recognition and targeting, stuff like that. This is use of it for autonomous systems. AI is taking off by leaps and bounds. This is not a technology. This technology may be developed in the United States or in China, but it's just going to diffuse all over the place. And so autonomous systems, there are all kinds of issues. And the third thing is, it strikes me that this is the sort of thing that will give people ideas. I mean, how hard do you really think it would be to fly several dozen armed drones into Reagan International Airport in the heart of Washington, D.C., and destroy a dozen civilian airliners? And what would be the consequences of that? Or anywhere else for that matter. So I think this actually has opened the door. And typically, yeah, we all knew theoretically this was possible, but when you see it demonstrated, and demonstrated against a serious military power, everybody sets up and takes notice. So I think this is actually, in that respect, a bigger deal. I also have to think, just in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war, this has to have an effect on senior people in the Kremlin, other than Putin. Now, maybe they can't do anything about it, but I'm sure they're thinking, what have we gotten ourselves into? And it does. I mean, we don't know how Trump has reacted to it. But it does suggest the Ukrainians have some cards to play, contrary to J.D. Vance and others.
Yeah, I love the memes that are floating all around the internet now of the meeting in the Oval Office, with Zelensky saying, I took out 15% of Soviet strategic long range aviation, and you haven't said thank you.
Well, the other one that I saw is Zelensky in a suit, which is just all kinds of different playing cards.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I've seen that one too. Look, I don't disagree with what you've said. And, in fact, I mean, one of the things that we did in the National Defense Strategy Commission report was try to, kind of arouse more public discussion and public recognition of the fact that, as you just said a moment ago, if we get into a conflict with China, or Russia, the homeland will not be a sanctuary.
right.
I think a lot of people have focused on the cyber dimension of that, and we talked about that in our report. And former FBI director Wray, the last real FBI director, testified to the fact in Congress that the Chinese are sitting all over our critical infrastructure. They can turn off our ATMs, turn off our electrical grid, water systems, you name it. But there's also a kinetic. I think people don't understand the potential kinetic side of this. And, there some number of years ago, back when you and I were in government, we both saw, intelligence reports about the fact that the Iranians had a cargo ship out in the Caspian, which they, rolled back the top of one of the holds, and up popped a missile. You could obviously do the same thing with drones. One of the more recent Chinese military power reports has indicated the Chinese have looked at cargo ships that can be, with containerized weapons on them. For that matter, what would stop somebody? Forget about. I have nuclear decapitation on the mind, so. What would stop someone from rolling up a bunch of trucks to the border in Canada and taking out big chunks of, Malmstrom, Minot, or F.E. Warren, where we have a lot of our, nuclear weapons based? Could they reach Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and take out a lot of B-2s? I don't know. Why not?
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I mean, I'm sure there'll be reactions the same way after the 1967 war, which began with an Israeli strike on Egyptian airfields, and actually Arab airfields around the Middle East. All of a sudden, everybody invested in aircraft shelters, hardened aircraft shelters, and so they weren't able to do that again. So I think people will be taking defenses more seriously, including things like high-powered microwave and all that. But
I
actually,
do hope, by the way, that our military takes this seriously, because I worry a little bit that there's a tendency in our, uniformed services to say, well, that's very clever. Those Ukrainians, they're really very clever, but they're fighting an asymmetric war. We don't have to do that because we're a big, powerful military.
So
I hope that
actually, on one of the chat groups I'm on, a mutual friend of ours who's a very thoughtful retired colonel, was saying, we keep on sort of patting the Ukrainians on the head like that, when what they're doing is they're taking commercial drones and repurposing them and fiddling with them in interesting ways. And if some kid in the 82nd Airborne says, "I've got an idea, why don't we just buy 15 drones, and I've got an idea for how you can rewicker these things and make them useful," you'd get into trouble for going outside channels. I mean, there's, one of the big challenges that any major military now has, but I think particularly ours, is being willing to take stuff that's off the shelf and then tinker with it and then field it. And one of the things that the Ukrainians did is they created the UAV command as sort of a separate service, and they didn't do it to create it in a separate service in our sense, with its own field of operation. It was to make the connection with industry much stronger and more direct. and as a way of kind of actually tying it much better to forces in the field. So, speaking of which, I read the Strategic Defense Review that the British just put out, which I think is I think this conversation is germane to that. So this has been awaited for a long time. It was it was run hands off by the government, which gave it to George Robertson, former distinguished Secretary General of NATO, Richard Barrons, who's former head of the Joint Forces Command for the British, who I actually met with in London, and a friend of ours who's been on the podcast, Fiona Hill. And there are a number of interesting things in it. I have to say, having read it, there's a lot of good. There's, they're clearly focused on Russia. There's very much this, understanding that the homeland could be under attack, that, we're in a different era of war. We have to be ready to fight a prolonged war. There's some interesting stuff about technology. They're very much in favor of the creation of a national armaments director, which they're doing. But the thing that really struck me about it is, of course, like most of these things, there isn't a dollar sign, or in this case, a pound sign attached to this. They're not willing to say, 2.3% of GDP, which is what they're currently spending, is ridiculous. We're going to need to be at least twice that. So there's that. And then the other thing that's missing, and this is apropos of our discussion, is, well, we don't really see that we need to have more soldiers. The British Army is like 73,000 troops, smaller than it was in most of the 19th century. But we can make it 10 times as lethal. And, in the future, only 20% of our force will be crewed systems, with human beings operating it or inside them, and 40% reusable kinds of things like drones that fly somewhere and do something, and 40% consumable. So I think they are very taken away by the vision of warfare that this opens up. But I have to say, I think that's failing to acknowledge what is a lesson of Ukraine that is applicable everywhere, which is, in a real war, there are a lot of casualties. You need to replace them. You need to have a system to replace them. And they sort of acknowledge that, but there's nothing that really addresses it. So first, I'm curious what you make of sort of the basic judgments that are there, but also, what do you think of the idea of having a strategic review that is done from the outside pretty much in that way? As somebody who has been, the vice chair of our defense commission, which is congressional, not the executive branch. So I'd like to hear you on both the substance, but also on the process.
On the process, I think that it was a very good idea to do this. I spoke actually with Fiona at some length about our own commission and what we had done, and we provided copies, obviously, of our report for her and George Robertson and General Barrons, and I was not alone, by the way. Another commissioner, Tom Mankin, also briefed Fiona at some length about what we did, and I've not read it as closely as you have. I've looked at it quickly, and I looked at they did a very nice, actually, 2-page summary of their recommendations and what have you. And the process that they went through seems to be very similar to what we did, which is in-depth interviews with all the senior leaders, but also people outside who have views about the world we're operating in and how to do it. I think it's a good idea to get a second opinion. I think most of the previous, British defense reviews were too inside, honestly, and therefore not able to address particularly some of the problems they have with acquisition as directly as this one did. I'm on the, strategy comes with a dollar sign, as Bernard Brodie famously wrote, and the lack of a pound sign here is, I think, more an indication of how difficult a situation a Starmer government finds itself in um, than anything else. And my worry is that, you know, to the degree, and I think by and large, other people have had, you know, positive view as you have of this report. Laurie Friedman had a pretty positive, you know, assessment of this in his blog this morning. My fear is it's not going to get implemented, and my fear is that it won't get implemented for this simple reason. I mean, there were some terrific articles in the Financial Times today going through what the report recommends, how deep a hole the British military is in, et cetera, et cetera. There also was a very interesting piece on public opinion. You know, public opinion, by and large, supports more spending on defense in Britain. Noticeably, the Labour Party has the lowest amount of support among its electorate for that. The Reform Party actually, I think, has the highest support, actually. But if you poll Britons on should you raise taxes, you know, overwhelmingly no. Should we cut social spending? Overwhelmingly no. And so the government is in a bit of a bind. This is 2 + 2 + 2. It's got to come out to 6. So how they're going to get around all that, I don't know. I suspect that some of the, we're going to substitute, lethality for mass, of personnel may come from, recognition of that conundrum, that it's somehow a way out of it. But because obviously, human beings actually cost more than anything else for Western societies in their budget. So I just worry about whether this thing is going to be, implemented or not.
It's the conundrum we all face. That and when I talk to people in London about this, when I was recently there, they acknowledge, the problem is you're going to have to cut some part of the welfare state to pay for this. And I think we actually face the same thing. We have a welfare state. We have a rather inefficient welfare state, although, at this point I stand up for Medicare, which is actually pretty efficient. Social Security in some ways is too, but
it's very parsimonious actually compared to European welfare states.
But we spend a lot of money on it, and right. You would either have to raise taxes to do the things we need to do, or cut the welfare state. And we're not willing to do either. This is part of it, sort of a deeper disease of the West, I think. By the way, this is just parenthetically, since you mentioned reform, would you want to place a small wager on whether Nigel Farage at some point gets to be Prime Minister of Great Britain?
I'm not taking that action.
Yeah. I mean, I follow British politics in part because it's fun. And increasingly, I'm coming to the conclusion at some point, he's going to end up as the prime minister. And God only knows what that'll be like. But I don't think it'll be Trumpian. It'll be a little bit wild and woolly. But
he's big on defense, though.
What?
He's big on defense. Unlike some of these other right-wing parties in Europe.
I think, I mean, in a way, this gets to the larger issue, which is, the Trump phenomenon is distinctly American, as you and I have often discussed, and it's got deep roots in all kinds of issues in our country. But I think a lot of European countries and other countries around the world have somewhat similar issues, with somewhat different roots, but they're there as well. And the British, I think, will have their Trumpian moment, except it'll be a Faragian moment, and it'll be over the same sorts of things. A lot of it driven by social attitudes and cultural issues. A lot of it driven by immigration, which is a huge issue for them. And it'll take us to a different world.
I don't disagree. I mean, the Polish presidential election is sort of one potential indicator. I mean, the counter indicator, of course, was the Romanian election, although that had all sorts of you know, special characteristics to it because the Supreme Court stepped in and outlawed one candidate, as the French have with Marine Le Pen. We'll see whether she actually gets to run and whether that helps or hurts the far right in France. I mean, they could come to power too, very easily. One could easily imagine that. So I think actually there's more. I don't want to say uniformity. I mean, all of this is expressed in particular political, cultural terms in each country, which are unique. But there are some common phenomena, as you say, one of which is migration. That has been a huge, part of it everywhere. Another part of it has been uh, the unequal distribution of gains from globalization, which have disproportionately affected working class, not just Americans, but working class people around the world. Um, the collapse of social democratic parties. I mean, that is true throughout Europe, but our Democratic Party is not a social democratic party, but I think you look at the polling and you could say that's a party pretty much in collapse. Um, and then one other element, which is I think, and this is a global phenomenon, the increased presence of women in the workforce, which I think has been very, sort of psychologically dislocating for a lot of men, and particularly younger men who now face competition in the workforce from women. I mean, in our case, it's also competition from the workforce from women who are more highly educated because more young men are dropping out and not completing a college education. Um, so I think there's a lot that's more common to all this than sometimes I think we give credence to.
I think there'll be one other issue, by the way, which is AI. I mean,
Yeah.
if I've begun reading more and more about that, and I'm beginning to think that over the next couple of years, you're really going to see this tidal wave of job destruction from AI. Now, we all understand the arguments. Okay, the buggy whip manufacturers go away, but there are jobs on the assembly line for Model T Fords. But I think this one is different. One thing that strikes me is that the destruction by AI of entry level jobs is really going to do a further level of damage, and I have to think it's going to have political repercussions if kids can't get a start doing things. And already, you're beginning to see unemployment rates go up for recent college graduates and that kind of thing. This is we're in for I think a wild ride here. I mean, there'll be wonderful things that come out of AI. All kinds of diseases that'll be cured, and there already are all kinds of conveniences. I mean, I don't know about you, but my map reading skills have deteriorated because I just let the car tell me where I'm supposed to go. But there'll be there's also at some point there are going to be a lot of people who drive cars and make supplement their earnings or maybe make their living out of driving cars, and they're going to be out of work.
No, I agree. I think, I think there's going to be a lot of repercussions from this. I agree. I tend to not allow myself to be too panicked by the kind of more apocalyptic vision or versions of this because we've had this before. I mean, computers were going to put everybody out of work. Their automation in the 60s was going to put everybody out of work. Machine tools. So um, I, I think there's going to be a lot here. Obviously, this can be very discomforting. But I mean, I still think just take a look at that. We were talking earlier about the HHS report that somebody tried to write with AI. There's still a lot of problems here where you really need a human.
This is the one that was making up
Yeah,
articles.
Yeah, making up
I mean,
sources.
it was very typical, I have to say, of the Trump administration that they put this out on a government website. Never occurred to them to have
Have a
anybody
human
check
check
any
it.
of it. Yeah.
I know, ridiculous. We need to get on to one other topic, which has been a major source of speculation this week, which is the situation in the Middle East,
Yeah.
which has a lot of different elements to it. One is what's going on in Gaza, what the Israelis are doing. Some of it's got to do with what's going on in Syria, what the Turks and what we are doing in
Yep.
Syria. And then, of course, a lot has to do with what Steve Witkoff, the president's Swiss Army knife negotiator, for all things, is doing with Iran in what looks to be kind of JCPOA, Iran arms nuclear arms deal 2.0, as far as I can tell. So what do you make of all this?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of different pieces to it. By the way, that last one, you shared an article with me, which Jake Sullivan was saying, well, on this one, I really agree with the Trump administration, which I must say is kind of confirming my view of Jake Sullivan's views of foreign policy and his astuteness as a statesman. So I think I'll try to take some of the different pieces of it. On Israel and Gaza, obviously, this is tragic. There's an interesting piece, I think, in Foreign Affairs by Asaf Orion, who's a retired Israeli, is he colonel or one star? I'm
No,
not
he was a
sure.
brigadier.
He was a brigadier, which is quite critical of the Netanyahu government, and I think correctly so. I think, in the center, so on the, it's not clear to me that they're actually going to be able to achieve anything. You're talking now about 20 surviving hostages plus a bunch of bodies. Um, I find it hard to believe that you can actually destroy Hamas as an entity in the way that they're trying to do it, which is by, moving people out of the way and then destroying everything. And I don't think they particularly have a plan for, I'm sure they have some plans, but I don't think it's not clear they've got a real plan for, what do you do with the population of Gaza after this? On the other hand, um, what I do think is so the basic idea that they had for the delivery of humanitarian aid, I think is right, which is that you cannot trust UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which was totally corrupted and taken over by Hamas. That Hamas has basically been able to use food supply as a way of controlling the population. And that also Hamas actually had stores of food that it just uses for its own people, its own fighters, and so forth. So there's that. And the idea is that you create a separate American-led relief foundation, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, I think, with American security guards on. How it's actually being implemented on the ground, I have to say, I can't tell. There are chaotic scenes, but I would expect chaotic scenes. In most humanitarian disaster areas are chaotic. I think all along the Israelis have simply not put the effort that I would have wished they would have put into the governance, the kind of post fighting management and administration of the area. One of the problems that I think that has obstructed that, whereas Americans can imagine counterinsurgency, in the way that we used to talk about during Iraq and Afghanistan, where you separate the population from the insurgents, if necessary, move them around. But then, you kind of get the passive or the active support of the population in, keeping the insurgents away. I think the Israelis think, and in this respect, they're probably right, that you're never going to be able to, they can never win that population over. And so they, in a certain way, classic counterinsurgency can never work for them. Now, that's partly because of choices that they've made along the way. So it's not as if this was simply a given. But that is, I think, the fix in which they find themselves. What's your take?
No, I agree with that. I mean, again, implementation is key here. I agree that you needed some other form of distribution than what you had before, which was totally corrupted. Ideally, what you would have had would have been some kind of international group, um, hopefully with some of the Arab states, maybe the Gulf Arab states, participating and funding the humanitarian relief administered by PMFs, private military companies, um, PMCs, and but the problem is they're trying to do that at the same time that they're trying to conduct military operations,
Yeah.
and that and military operations, as both you and as Asif Orion in the foreign affairs article you mentioned, both suggest to what end. I mean, what exactly is the political objective here, other than saving Bibi's bacon at home? And Asif, by the way, I know him a little bit. He's a very smart guy,
He's extremely smart.
a very smart, very capable officer. So, yeah, I think it's hard to see how anything good is going to come of this. I do think it links to some of the other things we're talking about, including Syria, where I understand sort of the Israeli concern about Syria becoming an ungoverned space with a lot of jihadists running around, but on the other hand, and here I'm going to say that I think the Trump administration at least seems to be trying to do perhaps the right thing, although typically I'm afraid it's going to do the right thing in the wrong way, which is to say to try and give this Syrian government a running chance at standing up and stabilizing the country and letting it become something different than what it was under Assad for 50 years, where it was just a constant thorn in our side, thorn in Israel's side, source of broader disruption, a cat's paw for the Iranians in the region. So I think it's good that they've got a special envoy. I'm not sure it's great that the special envoy is Tom Barrack, the ambassador to Turkey, because I think that may give too much weight to Turkish considerations here. And the Turks have a big interest in all this because they are a neighbor of Syria's. They've been a major sponsor of the HTS, the force that's taken a country over. But I worry that some of what the Israelis have done, which is, at one level understandable, is strikes on military bases and depots to try and make sure that these weapons don't get turned and used on Israel. That's all understandable. But I worry that some of what they're doing might bring about the very thing they're worried about, which is a, unstable, jihadi overrun Syria.
It's a devilish problem, and I think it would be for any highly capable American or Israeli government, and we don't really have either of those. I mean, for example, there was just a news item about, us clearing the way for the Syrians to bring several thousand foreign fighters into what's sort of the nascent Syrian army. I mean, look, this is one of the issues that people have not been talking about for a while because nobody wants to talk about Iraq and the Middle East. But, you have this floating army of thousands and thousands of jihadists who will go wherever there's a jihad. And, this is actually quite now at this point, quite an old phenomenon. I mean, I remember before 9/11, when I was on this advisory panel at CIA, they showed us this video, which had just been picked up in Jordan. It was a video about all kinds of foreign fighters who belonged to this thing called Al Qaeda, which I had never really heard of or I hadn't really paid much attention to. But now you have that, and those people go look. It started in some ways, I think, with the Afghanistan jihad. But these people will go from place to place, and they're not going to become, um, kind of normal law-abiding citizens who just want to do their bit and then return to civilian life. So I think it's a devilish problem. There's also another issue, which, given your history as an ambassador to Turkey, I think is particularly interesting. I'd like to hear your view. I mean, I am struck by the role that Turkey is playing. Now, on the one hand, it does seem to me to be sort of neo-Ottoman. With the Turks are playing this important role, and they play an important role in Ukraine, and on the whole, I think a beneficial one. They are present in Libya, as the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, very much was. I mean, that's where Kemal Ataturk really, cut his teeth as somebody who could lead insurgents. They are a presence in the Persian Gulf as well. And I guess the questions I have for you is, first, if our friend Henri Barkey, who's been writing about this, is right, and Erdogan's days are numbered, does this project end with Erdogan? And my instinct is to say, I bet you it doesn't. Although it would be good to see him out of the picture, but I have a feeling that this is sort of what you can expect from a prosperous, self-confident Turkey, although they've been having a lot of economic troubles recently. But the other thing is, should we welcome this? Should we have no alternative, I think, except but to deal with it. But how should we judge it?
There are a couple of different questions in there. So on the question of Erdogan's political longevity, I hope Henri is right. Certainly, he points to a lot of, ongoing problems that Turkey has. So domestically, including the fact that, even while Turkey's playing this very large role that you just described regionally, they're busy arresting more mayors and more mayors of districts in Istanbul, which sort of tells you that he's, uneasy, lies the head that wears the crown. He's clearly nervous about the domestic political situation. I read Henri's article with interest, and certainly I think it would be salutary for Turkey if Erdogan were to leave the scene.
You're not convinced?
I'm not convinced, and so far nobody's made money betting against this guy, in domestic Turkish politics. On the broader question, I do think Turkey's ambitions outstrip its means. And I think that sort of neo-Ottomanism and a large Turkish role in the Arab Middle East rings very differently in Arab ears than it does in Turkish ears. And I think one needs to pay some attention to that as well. We need a capable, able partner in Turkey, which has the largest, military in NATO. And in terms of European security, I know Europeans are looking towards the Turks now as an important part of the European security future. But I think that I worry that that's going to, incline people to look the other way while Erdogan continues with this authoritarian project. On the other hand, if you look at it from his point of view, which is kind of the one you sketched out, they're primus inter pares at a minimum in Syria. They've composed a lot of their differences with Iraq over the years. The PKK has voted to dissolve itself, which means that you are potentially sitting on the cusp of the end of a very mean and ugly, insurgency that killed over 40,000 Turks and Kurds in Turkey since the early 1980s. He's ensconced in Somalia and Qatar, as you said, and in Eritrea and, Libya. Turkey, though, remains very divided about this. I mean, Ataturk, famously had a slogan which was "Happy is he who is a Turk," and basically he wanted to get Turkey out of the whole business of being a Middle East superpower. Erdogan's trying to get them back in. I think Turks are divided over this. His policy in Syria was very unpopular until the Assad regime fell, which opened up the way for him to get these 4 million refugees who've been a charge on the Turkish Commonweal, for the last decade, kind of pushed across the border and back into Syria. So, does it survive him? I suspect elements of it will. And the appetite of Turks for a broader foreign policy, a bigger foreign policy, footprint in the region than we were used to in the Kemalist years. I think that's real, but I think without Erdogan, it might be a little bit more tempered and a little bit less likely to look for opportunities to be in opposition to us.
So we're just about out of time, but could you just say a few words about, what this very peculiar negotiation with the Iranians where, over the weekend they're saying, yeah, we're essentially going to give them a sort of JCPOA kind of deal where they can have low levels of enrichment, which, is to my mind giving away the store. And then Trump goes, no, that's not true. I mean, part of this is the internal disarray of the administration. And I think, by the way, I would interpret the Trump tweets as another taco, that he began getting public criticism for looking weak, which he hates. And so he therefore chickened out, which is, a little bit paradoxical, I suppose.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, it's very hard to read the tea leaves right now. I mean, the Iranians are saying they're going to reject this deal, which appears to, contain some steps that would allow them to continue to be able to enrich or to have the right to enrich. I mean, honestly, the Saudis have been telling the Iranians, take this deal. I think the Saudi advice is actually very good. If I were the Iranians, I would take this deal in a heartbeat. I don't know whether Iranian politics will allow them to do that. The deal, I think, I think Jake Sullivan's reaction to it is very revealing. I think, Jake basically said at Harvard, I think it was at Harvard where he was speaking, that, I'm looking forward to how the administration explains to, Senator Cotton and Senator Cruz how this is different from, what we did in the JCPOA in the Obama administration. Look, I think, again, we don't know exactly what's in the deal, but what it sounds like is something that allows the Iranians to maintain an ability to enrich, which is going to be very problematic from the point of view of the Israelis. Now, if the president decides that he's got the greatest deal of all time and he's going to tout it as such, as he did with North Korea in the first term, and that he's going to, go to Tehran and that they're going to build a Trump Tower in Tehran and he's going to make Iranians, great again. I don't know. We'll see how McConnell and Cotton and Cruz react in the Senate. I think there'll be some Democrats who will support this. I mean, I think Jake is just one indication of that, but I think you'll get support from, Jeff Merkley and Chris Murphy and other Democrats. There'll be some Democratic opposition as well, I suspect, from Schumer and Booker and maybe a few others. But I think where it will really leave Bibi in a very tough place, right?
Yeah, he is in a tough place. I mean, I think it just didn't dawn on the Israelis that if Trump betrayed everybody else around him, he's perfectly willing to betray you guys too.
Well, yeah.
Well, I think we're probably at the end. I think the cheery thing is that after discussing the contemporary world, the good news is that next week we'll be able to dive back into the past. So I just want to say I always look forward to talking with you, but I particularly look forward to what we're going to be able to do next week.
Well, I'm somewhat intimidated because I'll be talking to two of the leading experts on the American Revolution, which is not a period that I'm at all expert in, although I have read a little bit about it, including works by you. So we'll leave that till next week, but it should be a fun discussion. I'm looking forward to it.